Welcome to this video that's part of the pilot incapacitation series of videos where the passenger has the pilot with the proverbial heart attack, calls ATC thinking we're going to fix everything. Well, we're going to try. We're going to start with what I call phase one, where we're going to emphasize just basic, stable aircraft control while we get some help and gather some initial information. For the record, I'm filming this on January 6th of 2021. Just very briefly, by way of refresher, I divide these emergencies up into three phases. Phase one, the goal again is just stable flight, get some basic information. It can present to any controller in practically any kind of airplane. The passenger, who's now the pilot, getting on the radio calling us with the Mayday, can have practically any level of piloting experience themselves, so every controller needs to be able to understand how to handle phase one. Phases 2 and 3, I really want to get a CFI rated or an ATP rated controller who's going to deal with that. It's always going to be a team, okay, but I'd like a CFI or ATP pilot rated controller to kind of lead that team and be the person on the frequency in most cases. So that advanced training for those kinds of pilot rated controllers will be done in separate videos. This is just really about phase one. First of all, before we do anything else, I want to emphasize, do not switch frequencies right away. So just as one way of putting it, if you're working a sector and the sector next to you is staffed by somebody who's a CFI rated controller, do not tell somebody to switch frequencies. These people are either going to not know how to do it, or they think they might know how to do it. They're going to mess it up. Then we're going to lose them in frequency land, and that would just be a disaster right from the get-go. So do not switch frequencies right away. Keep them on your frequency, get the pilot rated or advanced pilot rated controller over to your sector or your position to help out, but do not switch frequencies right away, even if you think it's a good idea. It's an absolutely horrible idea. Okay. These are the 5 basic categories of information we need kind of right of way. Let me just kind of right away. Let me go through these. So first of all, we need to know something loosely about the airplane. What kind of airplane are we dealing with? Sort of categorize it a bit. In terms of the weather and time, I think that statistically just most of these will present in day VMC conditions. Occasionally it will be night VMC or IMC when the pilot's rude enough to have the heart attack, if you don't mind me putting it that way. But we're just going to have to deal with what we deal with. The medical situation, I covered this in the overview. I will briefly touch on it later in this video, but we want to assess whether there's any carbon monoxide poisoning going on, whether this is only affecting the pilot or whether this is a bigger problem. We want to get a little bit of information about the passenger who's now going to be the one flying. That's kind of a mouthful. I will tend to talk about this person as basically just the pilot from this point going forward. If in fact they're piloting the airplane, I think it's fair to call them a pilot. They could be anywhere from no flying experience at all to somebody who's a current single-engine pilot, but they're sitting in the right seat of a turbine twin or something and having to deal with something where they don't even know where to begin with this particular instrument panel. And when it presents to us, they might have the autopilot on, or the person might be hand flying. So I do have a preferred order, and I'll go through that in a second, but I don't want you to get too wrapped up in it, because even though I argue in good faith that there is a preferred order to this, ultimately, if you're kind of stuck for what the preferred order is and just in the heat of the moment, you in effect do it in the wrong order, that'll work and so on. We don't have to respond ideally, we have to respond effectively. Having said that, here's what I think the preferred order is. So first of all, I would focus on the person that we are talking to. Just get some general sense. By the way, I'm a big fan of getting on a first name basis rather than the tail number or the official call sign. Just get on a first name basis. So, okay, my name is, whatever your name is, what is your name? And do you have any flying experience? And just let them describe it in their own words. In that first round, just let them kind of briefly describe it. I wouldn't go into the full details of exactly what airplanes they've flown to exactly what level and how long ago and so on. Just let them describe it in their own words. You get an initial sense right away. Then I would focus on who's actually flying. Are you flying the airplane or is the autopilot on? And I'll talk about what to do in either of these situations, and also what to do if somebody says, I don't know if the autopilot's on or not, which is actually a very plausible possibility. The third thing I would focus on is the medical situation. So is this just one person, or is this a bigger problem, i.e. carbon monoxide poisoning? As far as the other two things, the airplane and the weather and time, I think we will sort of figure that out on our own very quickly. If you need to, you can ask some questions about that. But I would focus just on the person, okay, the autopilot, and then the possibility of carbon monoxide poisoning, and in that order, though the order is not a big deal. Okay, I'm going to skip any more detailed discussion about the passenger now pilot, because I have no particular value added. You're very smart. I think you know how to figure that out. I don't need to give you more details. As far as the autopilot, let me give you my thoughts on how to tell if the autopilot is on, and depending on whether it's on or off, what the very first step should be in terms of keeping the airplane stable. So first of all, a lot of these people aren't even going to know what the answer is. So we have to kind of address this before we address what to do if it's on or if it's off. My guess is in a lot of these cases the autopilot will be on. I can't really defend that. That's kind of a gut hunch, as it were. But we can't make assumptions, so it doesn't matter if I'm right or wrong. Okay, and also we need to protect for the possibility that the autopilot is off, because if so, we need them to start flying the airplane right away, and there really isn't a choice. And by the way, if the autopilot's off, I want to leave it off in virtually all cases. So if we don't know if the autopilot's on or off, I think what a lot of pilot-rated controllers, or for that matter non-pilot-rated controllers, might do is immediately start sending somebody off on kind of a wild goose chase looking around the instrument panel trying to figure out if the autopilot is on or off. I argue that's actually a mistake, and here's why. If the autopilot is on and we send them looking around the instrument panel for a minute, we're probably fine. We can kind of get away with it. But if the autopilot is off, or indeed if there's no autopilot installed in the airplane, so somebody should be hand flying the airplane, and instead we put this person kind of heads down in the cockpit looking around at this whole bewildering panel of gauges and switches and displays and everything else, trying to find the autopilot display. Nobody's flying the airplane. That's not really good. So even though I'm guessing the autopilot's probably on, we need to assume, as it were, that the autopilot is off unless and until demonstrated otherwise. And so what we need to do is get somebody to put their hand on the wheel or the stick. I say don't call it a yoke because that's pilot speak. I've seen a particular case where we had one of these kinds of situations, and practically the very first question that the pilot-rated controller asked the passenger who was now flying the airplane was basically, okay, take a look at the yoke. Do you see a button on it? And the person's response was literally, what's a yoke? Okay, well, the wheel or the stick. Yeah, I see a stick here. Okay. So just put your hand on the wheel or the stick, just one hand, okay? Just gentle fingertip pressure. Move the wheel or the stick around a little bit. Does the airplane seem to respond to what you're doing, or does it seem to be fighting you in some way? So what happens is, in an airplane like this, or in any airplane, if you're flying and you use fingertip control and you try to move the airplane, if the airplane responds to just that light fingertip pressure, then it's almost guaranteed that the autopilot is off, if there is even one in the airplane. And then the person is already doing the right thing. Just continue to use fingertip pressure. Just keep the airplane pointed basically where it is right now. Okay, that will generally be straight and level, or they probably would not have been able to call us in the first place. If the airplane does not respond to fingertip pressure, if it feels like it's kind of fighting the person and instantly goes back as soon as you relax the pressure a little bit, or it's sort of putting up a bit of a fight, either the autopilot is on, or there are some airplanes that are built, they're really like very stable to fly. You know, when you're hand flying, you have to kind of muscle a little bit. For some airplanes that are considered good IFR platforms to fly, good airplanes that have good handling qualities when you're hand flying IFR, it's actually good to have an airplane that's stable and just a little bit heavy on the controls, because that way it's stable. You have to kind of forcibly move it and so on. So if the airplane seems to be putting up a fight, either the autopilot's on or it's a fairly stable airplane that's in trim in such a way that we can sort of afford to kind of leave it alone for a moment while we sort of confirm whether the autopilot's on by now sending somebody to look around the instrument panel, either to confirm if the autopilot is off or what modes the autopilot is in. So first of all, how do we tell somebody how to find the autopilot controls? Because there are a variety of ways to do this. So what I've done here is I've pulled up 3 screenshots from airplanes that are in the current version of the new Microsoft Flight Simulator, along with one ad. So the 3 airplanes that I've pulled up are the analog gauge Cessna 172 up here on the upper left, the G36 Bonanza on the upper right, the Cub Crafters X-Cub on the lower right, and this is the control head for an S-Tech 3100 autopilot on the lower left. Don't worry what that is. S-Tech is a company that makes autopilots. There's Dynon, and there's a variety of others. I'm not going to give you a list of manufacturers and so on. Now, just using these four as an example. First of all, these can be practically anywhere on the instrument panel. They tend to be more or less in the center of the instrument panel, assuming that you have side-by-side type seating. If it's single width seating or tandem seating, then it's something different and so on. But okay, they could be anywhere from up on the glare shield, which is typical for turbine airplanes, although I don't have a picture of something like that here. It could be down near the bottom of the radio stack. If it's a side-by-side screen display, like you have on a typical G1000 setup, very often the autopilot controls are on the lower left of the right side display. Some G1000s, you have them here, and you have the identical buttons also on the lower left of the left side display, or the PFD, the primary flight display. In the X-Cub, the control head for the autopilot controls is a box that's down underneath like the single display in this tandem seating aircraft. An STEC 3100, I just have this pictured as if it's a standalone unit, but again, it can be mounted all over, different spots in the panel. Typically in the center for a side-by-side seating airplane, but who knows if it's up near the top or down near the bottom, or some airplanes it's actually down, just in front of the throttles, down kind of by where your knee would be if you sort of pictured extending this 172 picture or something. Okay. Well, if it can be almost anywhere on the panel, and it can have different buttons or different displays, how are we going to help them find it? Now, most autopilots, notice I'm hedging my bets a little bit because there's always exceptions, and it's only getting worse because there's so many companies out there with so many different ways of manufacturing these. Almost all autopilots have at least 4 buttons in common, because the number of buttons can vary with how sophisticated these things are and with the modes and so on like that, but I argue that most autopilots really have typically 4 buttons in common. So I'm going to use the STEC 3100 here on the lower left as my exemplar here. So the first one is an AP button, which is short for autopilot. There may or may not be a light next to it, like you see here on the STEC 3100. Sometimes there is a light that's more or less embedded in the button itself. Sometimes there's no light at all, but very often you will have an AP button, and that's more or less the master on-off switch, although there are typically other ways to turn it on and absolutely other ways to turn it off. In the KAP 140 that you see here, and the ones, don't worry about the KAP 140, there won't be a quiz later, but the Bendix King KAP 140 here in the 172, there's an autopilot button over here on the left. In the GFC 700 here in the G1000, it's on the upper left. Over here on the I think that's a GMC 307 control head for the G3X Touch on the X-Cub. The AP button happens to be more in the middle, okay, kind of over here. It can be like anywhere within the control head, but AP for autopilot is normally there. Again, there's always an exception somewhere. I'm aware of some. I'm not going to list them because it's not relevant to go through the whole list and so on. Another button that is almost always present is ALT, which stands for altitude, and that is an altitude hold mode. So here's the ALT, or the altitude button, on the STEC 3100. Here it is on the KAP 140. Here it is on the GFC 700, and here it is on the 307 control head. And then the other 2 buttons, I'll kind of lump them together. HDG for heading and NAV for navigation are usually present, not always, and if they are, they're typically going to be side by side in some form or fashion. So here's heading and nav, here's heading and nav. Heading and nav are vertically stacked here in the G1000 setup. Here they are kind of laterally stacked in the 307. But typically, if we're going to have somebody look around the instrument panel, we're looking for some kind of separate box, and I'm going to give you an exemption, or another exception later in the video. But typically, you're looking for some kind of separate box that has these 4 kinds of buttons: AP, ALT, heading, nav, and so on. And you have to be a little careful because there can be cases where you will have something like heading or altitude in a different context. So for example, on the Cub Crafters, notice there's a thing here that says heading, and next to it is altitude. Now that's actually just the label for these 2 knobs that would control what specific heading and what specific altitude you're selecting. So those things do interact with the autopilot, but they are not per se part of the autopilot control head, and they don't actually offer any direct information to us about whether the autopilot is on or off. Okay, so once they find this, if they can, Okay, that's one thing we're trying to do. Sometimes, again, I'll use the STEC 3100 here as the example. There are lights that are directly lit up. At other times, there are no lights lit up as part of it. So what I would try to do is get somebody to find the control head if they can even find one. If they do, I want to ask them to describe in their own words, are there any lights associated with any of the buttons? So again, it might be a light next to the button. It might be that the button itself is lit up. Also, is there anything on the display? And please read us all the stuff that's in the display. So let's take this STEC 3100 as an example. So we get them to find this thing because it has these kinds of buttons. It has other buttons as well. Okay, are there any buttons that are lit up? And if so, what do those buttons say? Now, I can't vouch for what somebody's going to describe, but I would think with the 3100, somebody's going to say, yeah, there's a little yellow light next to AP, a yellow light on next to FD, and a yellow light on next to YD. For what it's worth, that's autopilot, flight director, and the yaw damper. Don't worry about the yaw damper for our purposes right now. Whatever the yaw damper is in phase 1, you just leave it and let the so-called CFI ATP pilot-rated controllers deal with that one. But in this case, they might describe that, yeah, there are some lights over here on the left, and then the display says HDG. There's like a vertical line, and then it says VS0 and ALT 12,600. So this is in some kind of heading mode, and it's holding an altitude of 12,600 is what we would understand from that. If I go up here to the KP140 on the analog gauge 172, okay, there are no lights, but there is a display. We ask them to read the display. It says alert, and it says 0 feet. That particular autopilot is off, and that's just going to be kind of the default settings on the display if it's turned off. If we go over here to the G1000 setup on the G36 Baron, Bonanza, there are no lights associated with any of the buttons on this one, and same thing on the 307 control head here in the X-Cub. In an airplane like this, what we're often looking for is if we have like a glass panel display where you've got things like the airspeed, the altitude, and the compass, typically what you're going to have is up near the top, you're looking for some letters that are going to say things like AP, HDG, ALT, stuff like that. Without zooming in, see these 3 boxes up here that at the moment are empty on the screenshot I have of the G36, and see these 3 boxes that are empty at the moment on the X-Cub? That's where you would see that kind of information. That can vary a little bit, but typically that's going to be up near the top of the display and so on. But if you can, try to find out if the autopilot is on. Okay. Enough on that slide. Let's just talk about whether the autopilot's on. If the answer is yes, or we think it's yes, but we're not absolutely certain, the next thing to do is try to confirm what lateral and vertical modes we're in. So again, if you picture when I was talking about that STC 3100 display a moment ago, I was asking them to read us that. Okay, it had HDG. Well, that's heading mode, and a lot of these will be in either heading mode or some kind of nav mode. Now, some GPSs, again, there's a lot of variability out there. If they're in nav mode, some of them will say NAV for nav. Some will say GPS, some will say FMS, some will say LNAV. For our kind of phase 1 purposes, as I'm loosely describing it, nav, GPS, FMS, LNAV are all essentially the same. They're tracking a nav signal, and I'm just going to leave it at that. So you can have a nav mode or a heading mode. Typically, you can have something else. As far as the vertical modes, I bet most of these are going to be in something like an altitude or really an altitude hold mode. Okay, that should be self-evident what that means. It's just holding altitude. However, we might be a little bit unlucky and they miit be climbing or descending when this first presents to us. When that happens, it might be in a VS for vertical speed mode. It might be in an IAS, an indicated airspeed mode, or FLC. FLC is pronounced filch. Filch is just a fancy, cool pilot speak way of saying indicated airspeed hold mode. If the airplane also has an auto throttle, it's a bit more sophisticated, and that's why it's cool. But basically, it's going to be in a vertical speed or something like an indicated airspeed hold mode. If it's in one of those 2 modes during a climb or descent, almost always, again, there are rare exceptions, but almost always, somebody will have some kind of altitude pre-selected as the captured or the altitude to be captured, and so they might also see something like ALTS or something like that, altitude select, as an armed mode. In that case, what's going to happen is the airplane will climb or descend, pitching to either target a specific vertical speed or a specific airspeed until it gets to that altitude it's going to capture, and then it will level off and switch automatically from the armed alt select mode to the alt or altitude hold mode. Okay, my own preference is for heading mode because it's nice and simple, and vertical speed, set it for 0 or to some other value that we're going to manually control. But for now in phase 1, I would just leave it where it's at in almost all cases, and that's the only thing I'm going to discuss here. I'm not going to go into more detail in this particular video. As far as the throttle, I'll talk about that in a minute. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, if the autopilot is thought to not be on, or it's definitely not on or not installed, just use fingertip pressure to hold the airplane. Basically, just anything approximately straight and level is fine, unless you're heading for a cloud or a mountain, and then just fingertip pressure, gentle bank, and just turn the airplane. And again, that first turn or two might be a little rough, but just as long as we keep the bank gentle, and assuming it's VMC, this actually should go fairly well. I have a lot of optimism about that. Okay, in terms of the throttle, and I put throttle in question marks because in some airplanes it's technically the thrust lever or the power lever, but we're just going to call it the throttle. So the throttle basically should be ballpark 75% of its physical position forward. So if you think of all the way back to idle as like 0% and full power is 100%, it should be ballpark 75%-ish. So ask the person if they can identify where the throttle is or the thrust lever, and if they see the throttle, just approximately where is it? Is it way back to idle? Is it full power? Is it somewhere in between? And if they locate it and it's anywhere from about 50% to 100%, just leave it where it's at. Again, that's going to work for the vast majority of cases. There's always some exception somewhere, but typically it's going to be about 75%-ish, give or take. If there is an exception, my guess is that the exception is if this happens like in a descent, the problem might be that somebody might be descending in a vertical speed mode. They're going to capture an altitude here in a minute or two. They have the proverbial heart attack, and during the descent they pull the power back to maybe like a 30 or 40% throttle position. What's going to happen is very quickly the autopilot presumably is going to capture that altitude, level off, but if nobody touches the throttle, it's just going to stay there, and then the speed's going to decay, and then we're going to get into something dangerous. So if the throttle is down at some lower value, okay, and it's typically with the autopilot on vertical speed mode, or they happen to be hand flying when they had the proverbial heart attack and they were descending with the throttle kind of pulled back, what we're going to want to do is bring the throttle gently up to a little bit more than half, maybe up towards the 75% physical position. If you're hand flying, descending, and you bring the throttle up to about 75%, that's going to be good enough for kind of phase 1 purposes. If they're descending, getting ready to capture an altitude, if you do it right away, the airplane's going to accelerate some during the descent, so that might be just a little bit trickier. I can't cover every situation, but what you'd like to do is, unless the airplane is temporarily in a descent, throttle should be ballpark 75%-ish. Okay. Let's switch gears and talk about the carbon monoxide. I had talked about in the overview video, it's typically headache or nausea. There are other possible symptoms, so blurred vision, dizziness, drowsiness, loss of muscle power. Very briefly, let me go to our friend, the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. The very last chapter, chapter 17, is about aeromedical factors. And on page 17-12, it talks about carbon monoxide poisoning. So let me go to that very briefly. Just very quickly, carbon monoxide is a colorless and odorless gas produced by all internal combustion engines. If a strong odor of exhaust gases is detected, assume that carbon monoxide is present. However, it definitely can be present in dangerous amounts even if there's no exhaust odor detected, because it is itself colorless and odorless. Now, by the way, there are disposable and inexpensive carbon monoxide detectors that are widely available. You might even have one in your car. I don't know, probably not, but you might. In the presence of carbon monoxide, these detectors change color to alert the pilot of the presence of CO. Just for what it's worth, my personal opinion, these are fine, but they're not normally in your normal visual scan unless you kind of think to look for it. You might not notice it for these disposable and expensive ones, so I don't know how much value they are in the real world. I mean, go ahead and use one in your airplane, but I'm not sure that they're particularly valuable. Some effects are headache, blurred vision, dizziness, drowsiness, and or loss of muscle power. So if we go to ask a passenger who's now taking over the controls if they're sick, some people, of course, get air sick. Okay, so if it's just nausea, you might assess if it's some kind of an air sickness type of a thing. But anything else, headache, blurred vision, dizziness, drowsiness, loss of muscle power, certainly, nausea that doesn't seem to be an air sickness type thing, you've got to suspect that it might be carbon monoxide poisoning. And we'll talk about how to deal with that in a second. But for the moment, I'll start with this. It says anytime a pilot smells exhaust odor or anytime that these symptoms are experienced, immediate corrective action should be taken or must be taken, including doing things like turning off the cabin heat, opening any fresh air vents that you can, open any windows that you can, and use supplemental oxygen if available. So with that, we'll kind of jump out of the pilot's handbook of aeronautical knowledge. We'll go back to this. So if we find out that there are other symptoms from the passenger who's now on the radio, or if there's symptoms from other people on the plane, and if there's any suggestion this is more than just a kind of an air sickness kind of a thing, okay, you've got to suspect possible carbon monoxide poisoning, and as much as I would like to try to stay relaxed in these situations, you've got to get started on this right away or the problem becomes much worse. So step one, you have to alleviate the problem. Help them locate the cabin heat control, and cabin heat has to go off. I don't care if they're cold. They've got to turn that off. Vent if possible. So it's going to vary airplane to airplane on what you can do. If there's a window that can be opened in flight, open the damn windows. If there's a vent that can be opened, crank the vents open. Again, I don't care if you're cold. Some airplanes you might be able to crack the door open a couple inches. Don't worry about that one if you really can't. Rarely you might have this happen with a pressurized airplane. If so, they're going to have to dump the pressurization. It's beyond the scope of what I can talk about here to describe for all controllers how to do that in a wide variety of airplanes. But if you get into a situation like this and it's a pressurized airplane, what I would recommend you do, because we have to get going on this right away, is enlist the help of some other pilot on frequency. So assuming you have other airplanes on frequency, just key up, is there anybody on frequency who can tell this passenger how to dump the pressurization in Piper Malibu or, whatever it is, right? Okay, and let that other pilot come on and handle that particular chore. Most of these airplanes will probably not have oxygen masks, but if they have one and they know how to don it and so on, then put the oxygen mask on. And then step two, if we have potential carbon monoxide poisoning, I'd recommend preparing for a possibly rushed landing. I wouldn't do the landing right away. Still want to get the so-called advanced pilot rated controller in there to help with that. But you can kind of get started on the preparation, so begin the descent as soon as possible. You'll see a little bit later kind of how to get the descent going, but the simple version is this. If they're hand flying, have them bring the throttle back to idle. Remember, pitch trim is going to control the speed, so they're not going to slow down. So when you bring the throttle back to at or near idle, the airplane will start a descent at the same speed. It might phugoid around a little bit, and that's why I showed all that stuff to you in the Flight 1 and the so-called Flight 1 follow-ups. But basically, it's going to be speed stable and just start a descent. If the autopilot is on, then we need to get it in the correct vertical mode, starting a descent, and also bring the power back. I'm just going to leave that description here. Okay. General first steps, I don't have these in any particular order. So we're trying to just stabilize while we get the basic pilot qualifications of the person who's now on the radio. Get on a first name basis. Give them your first name. Get the new pilot's first name. I would ditch the regular call sign for about 17 different reasons. Find out which seat the person is in. Most airplanes are going to be side-by-side seating, and in a lot of these cases, the person who's now on the radio is going to be in the right-hand seat. That can affect everything from instrument sight lines to being able to reach switches and knobs and things like that. Ask for people on board, okay? Partly because some of those other people can help with things like stabilizing the pilot. And by that I just mean in the physical sense. Make sure the pilot has a shoulder strap on if one's available. In some cases it can be good to push the seat back of the pilot. Both the shoulder strap and pushing the seat back is partly to keep the pilot from maybe slumping over into the controls, which would be bad because it's going to typically put the plane in a nosedive if they suddenly slump into the yoke or something like that. Going back to the seats for a second, a lot of these people are going to be in the right-hand seat. The airplane flies just fine from the right-hand seat. As a flight instructor, I fly in the right-hand seat all the time. It flies the same. It just looks slightly different. The passenger, it's kind of looking novel and new anyway, so it doesn't really matter in some sense. It's just the instrument sight lines and switch reaching. On tandem seat airplanes, I don't know if the passenger is going to be in the front seat or the rear seat. Again, I've flown front seat and rear seat on multiple airplanes. It's not a big deal. You're going to have worse sight lines if you're in the rear seat, and in most of these airplanes you will have fewer instruments in the rear seat because all the instruments are up front. You just have to kind of reach your head around a little bit to read some of the instruments. Again, not a big deal, and so on. On occasion, if it's somebody in the rear seat, they're not going to have any access to some of the switches or some of the secondary flight control kind of things. Again, the airplane, you can still fly it even as a passenger. That just makes it slightly more complicated. Not a big deal. Okay, obviously get help from a so-called advanced pilot-rated controller. I would like these to be CFI or ATP-rated controllers, and I would really love for them to go through some of the advanced training that I'm getting started on this course. I want them to interact with it and make it better. So that will help them with the advanced training. Also, as soon as possible, get other controllers to help listen in on the frequency, regardless of their pilot ratings, just so that they are extra set of ears. And please, please, please take written notes of everything that's going to go on. There's a handful of reasons for doing that. I don't want to go through all of them. There's certainly no downside, but take written notes and so on. If possible, and if you need to, start to move the airplane in the general direction of where you're going to send them for the landing. And also, if they're heading right towards clouds, imminent terrain, then clearly you need to move them a little bit. Avoid frequency changes. Make them very cautiously if you're going to do them at all. And I'll talk a little bit more later in the video about the transponder. Short version is ident is actually pretty simple. Squawking 7700. If it's even necessary, that's generally pretty easy to do, but we'll talk about the details of that later. Okay. As we're looking at awaiting transition into phase 2, and what I mean by that is we're trying to get a CFI or ATP rated controller, if one is available, to help out for phases 2 and 3. What should we do to sort of kill time? Or maybe that's a bad way to put it, so maybe I should describe it as filling the time wisely, okay, while we're waiting for the so-called advanced pilot rated controller to help out. Well, while keeping the airplane stable and keeping them from running into a cloud or a mountain, let's try to establish radar identification if possible. Okay, I think it's a good practice to have an FLM or CIC begin tracking the airplane via flightaware.com. And again, I don't want to go through all the advantages to doing that, but that just gives us a way to track them with regard to the local terrain and so on. Not a big deal, but that's useful. Also, I would ask the passenger, who's now the one flying the airplane, to describe in their own words what they see and understand around and about the airplane instrument panel as far as the instruments, the controls, the switches. That actually serves several purposes. So again, you could think of it as we're sort of filling time. This is one way to assess what's actually going on, and at the same time, we're assessing how competent this person is. Is this person have any idea what they can, make, what sense they can make out of the instruments and the switch labels and the placards and things like that? Do they seem to know their way around the cockpit, or at least a cockpit? Maybe they're good with some things like understand the radios quite well, but they really don't know much about the controls other than they know like the flaps slow the airplane down. But actually get them to describe in their own words what they see, and just in their own words, at their own pace, in their own order, go around the instrument panel and then have them pause at different points and just ask them clarifying questions. So I'll show you some examples of that in a little bit. And the way to do that and to have some quote-unquote fun as we finish the video, we're going to hop in the flight simulator. I'm going to do 3 short flights in these so-called phase 1 situations in 3 different airplanes so you can kind of see what this is going to look like. For the record, here are the flight sim settings that I'm using. Nothing that's a big deal, so let's go fly. The first of the 3 airplanes we're going to hop in is the Cub Crafters X-Cub. You've already seen a screenshot of the instrument panel, and so I've got the airplane selected. And within Flight Simulator here, if you just click on some random spot on the map and hit Set as Departure when it says Custom, it's going to set us up airborne at 1,500 feet. I'm going to hit Fly, and while it's loading, I'll note that the way Microsoft does this, if the airplane has an autopilot, it will default with the autopilot on in the most basic modes available. You'll see that in a minute. It will set us up northbound. It will set us up at some kind of cruise power setting. And so as soon as we get flying, I'm just going to set the physical throttle on my yoke here, my gaming yoke, to about the 75% position and so on. But anyway, let's get going. I'm not sure. I think we're somewhere over Texas or so. Okay. Now, Obviously, I can't vouch for what somebody's going to say, but for our purposes for this video, I'm just going to assume that they've presented to us as, hey, my pilot's maybe had a heart attack or something. Maybe my pilot's dead. I'm a passenger. I need some help here. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Okay, so what, again, should we as controllers do? Step one in my preferred order is just find out some basic things about, okay, so you're flying the airplane. Are you a pilot? Have you taken flying lessons? Do you know what you're doing? And the person's going to give whatever answer they give to us. Let's get on a first-name basis with them. Step two, is the autopilot flying the airplane or not? And for the discussion purposes, I'm going to assume that somebody says, well, I think so, but I'm not sure. Okay, we're not sure. Okay, put your one hand on the wheel or the stick. I'm just scrolling down to where you can see the stick here. And I want you to imagine that I'm just lightly holding the stick down here. Just light fingertip pressure, kind of move the airplane left and right a little bit and let me know if the airplane kind of responds or if it's sort of fighting back a little bit. So watch what happens if I just move my yoke here a little to the left for a second and then let go. It just banked a little bit, kind of stopped there and then immediately came back. Let's do one to the right. Now that's the way it's dealing with that in the sim. But basically, I would expect in this situation, somebody says, well, it's kind of fighting me a little bit. As soon as I would let go, it came back and so on. Okay, so let's start off with kind of, all right, leave your hand on the stick, just light fingertip pressure, but it looks like you're straight and level now, so just sort of leave the stick where it's at, kind of straight and level. Look around the instrument panel. Do you see anything on the instrument panel that might control the autopilot? You'll probably see some buttons that say AP, ALT for altitude, HDG for heading, things like that. Now again, remember when I showed you the screenshot of the X-Cub, somebody might say, yeah, I see something that says heading and altitude, okay, that happens to be on the display, but we might say, okay, is that on like a separate box or is that on the display? And in this case, well, it's on the display, it's not a separate box. Okay, is there maybe, we might come back to that, but is there a separate box that says HDG, nav, ALT for altitude, AP? Okay, yeah, I've got one down here down at the bottom. Okay, and just let's confirm, so what other buttons, if any, do you see on that? Well, I see a knob that says HDG, I see a button that says APR, FD, there's like a one with the blue outline that says LVL, and so on. Yeah, so that's going to be the autopilot control head, as it were. Okay, and then the other thing to look for is on like the glass panel display, if there is one. Up near the top, do you see anything that again says like AP and maybe some other letters near it that are going to say anything? And if so, read those off to us. Well, here we go. So I see AP in the middle, and to the left of it, it says ROL, and to the right of it, it says PIT. Okay, in this particular example. Make sure you're taking written notes, right? Among the reasons for the written notes is that way, assuming that our so-called advanced pilot rated controller comes walking into the position in a couple of minutes and so on, we can give them kind of some written notes that are showing what's going on, and maybe there's even a form we can use to help standardize this a little bit, although that's for a later date. So what this is telling us in the X-Cub right now is the autopilot is on. It's in a roll hold mode, which is basically going to keep the airplane at whatever bank angle. Okay, and PIT, which is a pitch hold mode. Okay, we're going to assess for the carbon monoxide stuff. I'm not going to go through that here. We might see if there's anything they can do to stabilize the pilot as far as seat belts or moving the seat back. Well, in this case, our person maybe is up front, and the pilot was sitting in the back. Well, there's nothing really you can do there, so that's where it's at. Again, we can do some other things. So just what's the physical position of the throttle? So can you find the throttle and where is it? Yeah, and it looks like it's kind of up towards the high end. It's maybe not full throttle. It's not, but it's more than in the middle. Hey, that's perfect and so on, kind of for phase one purposes. Okay, and then while we're waiting for the advanced pilot rated controller to kind of come around, we might try to ask them to take us on a tour of the instrument panel and describe for us what they know. I'm going to basically end the X-Cub here. I will note a couple other things for what it's worth. If we ask them about the cabin heat stuff, because we're concerned about carbon monoxide poisoning, the X-Cub does have carburetor heat. That is something totally different. In this airplane, the cabin heat, and notice it's actually pulled back as if it's hot. I'm going to push that as if we're mimicking turning the cabin heat off. And in the X-Cub, if I come over here, again, don't memorize this because there's going to be 1,000 ways of doing it, but in this airplane, you can open up the windows in flight, and the sim is not going to let me click this, but you would basically just take this handle and you can open up the window in flight, and if you're cold, so be it, but you're dealing with potential carbon monoxide poisoning, and among other things. Not only is that good in and of its own accord, the pilot may or may not kind of come back to consciousness. Generally speaking, my understanding on carbon monoxide poisoning is once somebody is unconscious, it's going to take something like medical assistance or an hour before they kind of wake up. So that's going to help, but don't expect the pilot's going to come roaring back to consciousness. Okay, we're going to end the X-Cub here, and we're going to switch gears into a second airplane. We are going to jump into one of the Diamond 40s that's in the current version of the flight sim. We are going to hop into the Diamond DA40 TDI, and we started over, I didn't pay attention, but somewhere Texas-ish. Let's start somewhere over maybe in the mid-Atlantic states, somewhere around the Mason-Dixon line-ish is about where I click. I don't particularly care where I'm at. For my purposes, it actually works out nice if at 1,500 feet AGL northbound we're heading towards a mountain, but we'll see what we get. This will load up in a second. We also get a little terrain anomaly over here, which still happens. All right. So let's just kind of get going and see what we've got. All right, so we're going to assume this presents to us, and practically the first thing we're going to want to find out, get on a first name basis, and whether this person has any pilot qualifications. Again, I'm going to assume that basically the person, you know, has taken no qualifications, or maybe this is the spouse who took a couple of pinch hitter courses several years ago, but, you know, doesn't really know much and so on. All right, in this particular airplane, one of the first things we want to assess is whether the airplane's on autopilot or not. For the discussion purposes, I'm going to assume this person says, I don't know, okay? All right, so first of all, just fingertip pressure. So grab the stick or the wheel and just light fingertip pressure, okay? And just move it left and right a little bit. Does the airplane kind of respond to your inputs? Well, yeah, if I bank left, it looks like it's going left. If I move the stick to the right, it looks like the airplane banks to the right. And then just notice for our purposes at the moment that, and I'm not touching it right now, it's kind of stable where it's at in that gentle bank. It'll slowly work its way back. So right now it does not seem like the autopilot's on. Okay, just keep the light fingertip pressure on the stick. If you need to, just make some very small movements and try to keep the airplane flying more or less straight and level. And let's just kind of confirm about the autopilot. So look around. Do you see anything that looks like a radio type box or a control box that has buttons on it that say things like AP for autopilot, ALT for altitude, HDG for heading, anything like that? And so again, while the person is moving just light fingertip pressure, I'm kind of just bouncing around a little bit, but so they're looking around and they look for a moment and say, no, I don't see anything. Okay, sounds to us like you're hand flying. Just keep the airplane basically straight and level. We have some help on the way very quickly. We're going to try to figure out if there's any carbon monoxide poisoning. Do you have any dizziness, nausea, headache, anything like that? And in this example, for discussion purposes, somebody might say, no, I feel fine. My stomach is a little nauseated, but I think that's just air sickness. And we've got one of these little carbon monoxide detectors in the airplane, and it looks like the color is okay, so I don't think we have carbon monoxide poisoning. Okay, cool. For what it's worth, in this particular airplane, this is the cabin heat, so you would move it up to turn it on, back to turn it off. You could do this for that little vent, you could do this for that little vent, and so on. Okay. But again, just stable flight, anything close. And even here, if I'm just going to kind of purposely put it in a gentle left turn and sort of leave it there. As long as they're anywhere close to straight and level, at the moment we're in a gentle left turn, we're doing kind of a gentle climb, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so we've got help on the way while we're waiting. Okay, just take us through what you see on the instrument panel. We just want to get some basic information and see how much you know. And again, they're going to put it in their own words. Let me just highlight a couple things as we do kind of our own small tour. For the airspeed indicator, it's good to kind of assess not only what the actual number is, but also where it is on the colors. Ideally, a little bit later on as we start to get into phase 2, I love the idea of getting somebody down pretty much around the top of the white arc for a couple of different reasons. Here in phase 1, just kind of find out where they are. Usually these will present to us with the airspeed in the green above the white. That I think is going to be normal, and that's actually fine. You're almost never going to have somebody up in the yellow already. Most of these airplanes you don't get in the yellow unless you've got a lot of power and are descending. So just anything in the green, especially if it's up above the white, is like perfect for phase 1. Altitude, if they can read the altimeter, that's great. At this airplane, we're at 3,900 feet. We're coming up on 4,000. If they struggle to read the altimeter, so be it. Okay, and we're going to use that altitude information to correlate with the radar display. Okay, for what it's worth, while I'm on the altimeter, let me just mention I wouldn't even mess with the altimeter setting. So watch as I come up just coincidentally on 4,000 as I spin the knob here from 2992 down to say 3002. Well, that's a 100-foot difference. That makes no difference in the big scheme of things. I wouldn't even mess with the altimeter setting. If they're off a little bit, it doesn't matter. You know that they're registering 50 or 100-foot difference. Makes absolutely no difference in the big scheme of things. Okay, so in terms of a compass, they may or may not understand that this is a 240 over here, this is a 30 over here, because they're not normally going to know to attach the 0 to the end. On the compass, see if they're kind of looking at north, south, east, west, that they understand this is a compass. For the vertical speed, don't worry about that too much. For what it's worth, because I'm hand flying, we've got a very gentle climb going. That's fine. Now, if we're trying to stop that climb because we've got clouds up above, the only thing to do is notice that the power right now is at like 90% on this kind of load meter, as it were. I'm just going to bring the power back just a tiny bit. So here we go. I'm not touching anything else. It actually moved it. It was at the default 90 to where the throttle is now. I'm going to bump it more to maybe 75-ish. But, okay, so we're just going to phugoid a little bit. This is probably going to settle out ballpark level flight. The turn coordinator for VMC purposes, and I'm laughing at all these terrain anomalies, but for the turn coordinator, you can just ignore that. That really is meaningless for our purposes, especially in phase 1, but even later. For some of these other things, let me kind of bring the zoom in over here for a minute and focus on this. This happens to be known as a Garmin 430, so this is going to provide our comm radio selection stuff, nav radio stuff. Because we're going to give radar vectors, they don't need to worry about any of the nav stuff. They don't need to worry about any of the GPS stuff. And there are so many variations out there. I really don't want to get into those for the most part. I will note the comm might be useful, and so let's talk about the comm indication for a minute. Very often, again, there's always exceptions, but the comm radio, and this one's only modeling one radio in this particular airplane. I'm just going to kind of level the wings here. Again, I'm hand flying by basically just staying hands off and leaving the airplane stable. But these comm things, if they get to a box and there's like a whole lot of information on it, you might have them read various digits and any text on there. So they might get to this one and to say, it says COM, C-O-M, and underneath it there's some numbers, 124.00, and then the 124.85 is highlighted. That's actually a fairly typical description for something like this. What that is, that means that this particular COM radio, now, in some airplanes there's COM 1, COM 2, so they might be looking at COM 2 and they're actually broadcasting on COM 1, so be careful about that. But at the moment, this is just COM 1 and it's the only one on here. 124.00 is the frequency that the airplane is currently on, and the reason this is highlighted is because if you move the knobs, that's what's going to change. So for example, if I want to switch frequencies to whatever, the big knob here is going to manipulate the digits on that highlighted part, and then the small knob will manipulate the digits to the right. Okay, and then once you select what you want, so I just randomly picked 135.5. Once you're ready to switch, you'd want to do this very, very carefully, but you should see something that typically has a double-headed arrow. Sometimes you might see a C on it for COM as opposed to V for like VOR frequency type stuff. But anyway, just flip-flop that, and now 35.5 is the active, 24.0 is on standby. If they get lost, make sure we prep them before a frequency change. If it doesn't seem to work, okay, then push the double-headed arrow again. It just flops them, and now they're back on the 24.0. On occasion, some of these, you might have the knob be a little more confusing. And so, like if you get the COM part and one thing is highlighted, and VLOC where nothing is highlighted, it might be, and I'm going to push this. Notice this is a toggle between whether I want to, and notice it says push between C and V. This is pushing between selecting something in the COM area or the VOR area. So it might be, again, write this stuff down. If they say something like VLOC and it says 110.50, and then it's highlighted 113.9. Again, write that down, and the so-called advanced pilot rated controller will know what to do with that. So before a frequency change, we're going to have them find the knob that says push CV, get up there, manipulate to some new frequency, and flip-flop it, and so on. The transponder, let me kind of come down here, and I'm going to zoom out just so I can still see a little bit outside, but again, I'm hand flying, but the airplane's pretty stable. I've got the power set to where we're kind of level. We're not going to hit anything, and so we're basically straight. I can afford to just relax. Okay, the transponder. There, again, there's going to be a variety of stuff with the transponders. One thing to note about this particular one, I think this is loosely built on a Garmin 330, it looks like. But remember, if we were asking them to look for the autopilot and look for buttons that included ALT, well, this one has an ALT button. That's typically going to happen on a lot of transponders. So if you get to a box and they see ALT, that's not necessarily the autopilot. Are there other buttons on here? Okay, like heading or nav or AP? No. Okay, what other buttons do you see on that box? Well, I see one that says ident, one that says VFR, and so on. Okay, that's the one of the idents, the transponder. That's pretty easy, right? By the way, while we're here, if you need to get them right or identified, switching codes might be a problem, but if they find an ident button, there's nothing bad at all that can happen by hitting the ident button. So push the ident button. Okay, for the moment you'll see the display, it's lighting up ident, and that's just letting them know that they're identing. We'll see what we see on our scopes, right? Okay, so ident, if they find the ident button, they can push that. It's bone simple. For some of these, to change the code, let's just say, for the sake of discussion, we want to give them a code. I'm just going to do, I don't know, 4321. For some of these, you just go 4, 3, 2, 1, and there it is. Sometimes there might be an enter after you're done with the code. If I want to put them on a 7700 code, 7700. Okay. If you want to put them on a VFR code, you can have them squawk 1200 manually, or a lot of these have a VFR shortcut, and that just puts them on the 1200 code here in the US. Okay, again, they might describe all kinds of different things. If they describe the flaps to us, it would be helpful if they also read us any placards about the speed limits for the flaps. That is useful. Rule of thumb going forward is, and I'm just correcting the bank a little bit, is generally I only want to use 1 notch of flaps at most for most of these airplanes. I actually do not like going to full landing flaps for the landing. I think the risk far outweighs the benefits for what it's worth. Okay, I'm going to kind of leave that here. You get the idea. Again, everything's going to be different, but if you're sort of filling time wisely, waiting for the so-called advanced pilot rated controller to show up and help with phases 2 and 3, just get started on a tour of the instrument panel, and whatever they're describing, pause, get information from them, write it down, and that's going to help going forward. All right, the last airplane we're going to jump into, and I have a particular reason, a couple of particular reasons for looking at this one, is the JMB VL3. We've been kind of here, we've been kind of here, so let's go out west somewhere. Let's see what we get. Kind of thinking we're somewhere in Nevada-ish, so with any luck we'll see a UFO around Area 51. Not that that really exists. All right. This will load up in a second. Okay, let's see what we've got to deal with here. All right, so first of all, we're going to assume that they're calling us with their Mayday. First thing we're going to do is find out kind of first name basis, what kind of pilot qualifications they have, if any way. For our purposes, I'm going to assume that this person is just a friend who came along, who's ridden in light airplanes a couple times before, a reasonably intelligent person, but they're not a pilot. They're not familiar with this particular airplane and so on. All right, step 2, do you know if the autopilot's on? I have no idea if the autopilot's on. Okay, first of all, do you see any box, any kind of radio control unit, anything like that that has these buttons, AP, ALT, heading, nav, things like that? And so for our purposes, we're going to kind of look around, and no, I don't see anything right now. Okay. Sorry, I made a mistake. Let's do the fingertip pressure first. So fingertip pressure, and it's kind of fighting us. Okay, now we're going to go around and look for the autopilot control box. No, we don't see one. Okay, now, do you have any glass computer screens on the instrument panel, or is it more like a bunch of round gauges? No, there's some computer screens. Okay, maybe on the one in front of the pilot, if that's the way it's set up. Do you see anything particular up near the top that says like AP on it, and any other text near there? And for our purposes, I'll zoom in a little bit. This is going to be, for our purposes, kind of like we saw with the Cub Crafters X Cub. So yeah, it says AP, it says ROL for roll, and PIT for pitch. Now, at the moment, what that's doing is it's just keeping the airplane basically wings level. It's keeping the nose basically pitch 0 and so on. And because the throttle happens to be in kind of a 75-ish % power setting, I might move it just a little bit. Okay, because we're 75-ish % power and the nose is more or less level, we're going to be basically pretty darn level. In this case, I got kind of lucky for my crazy nutty purposes, and we are sort of headed towards a mountain. Okay, the way this is set up, I'm a little bit lucky the way I got this, but picking Nevada, I thought the odds were with me in a way. Let's assume that we don't have time to get our so-called advanced pilot rated controller, or even any pilot rated controller in here, and they say like, I'm heading for a mountain, I've got to turn the airplane and I'm on autopilot here, what do I do? Okay, first of all, one brief aside in the VL3, in the real airplane, this is a touch screen, and so the way you would manipulate it is the autopilot's actually controlled by touching here. Okay, I'm clicking, you can't really tell, but I'm clicking here as if I'm reaching forward and touching the screen. Nothing's happening just because Microsoft doesn't model it. And among other things, that's a reminder that Microsoft does not model everything perfectly here in the sim. I assume some functionality will come later as the product matures. Having said that, okay, how are we going to get this autopilot off? For the moment in this airplane, I'm just going to use the keyboard shortcut. In the real airplane, they would actually have to reach up and touch that touch screen, so they would basically click here. It's going to bring up a little window here, and they would turn off the autopilot with the AP button. There might be in some airplanes a button on the stick, but you'd actually probably prefer that I shut up and do this. So here in the sim, I'm just going to hit the Z key, Z as in Zulu, which is a keyboard shortcut for the autopilot master on and off. When I hit that in a second, it's actually going to turn off the modes. You'll still see AP enunciated, which is, to my mind, a bug, because that should go off if the autopilot's off. So autopilot's off, and even though it says AP, that's just a bug here in the sim. So now, light fingertip pressure, I'll start to move the airplane a little bit and just kind of bank away from the mountain. Okay. At this point, see if there's anything that you can do to secure the pilot, try to detect any carbon monoxide poisoning. This one doesn't look like it has one of these detectors around here. For what it's worth, just while I'm kind of maneuvering out this way, the flaps are a separate electrical switch up here. This is the thing for the landing gear. Here's the comm radio, so you would have to use these knobs. You can flip-flop it with the double-headed arrow that looks different. This is actually the transponder, and the transponder, I'm just going to go kind of wings level here and avoid mountains. The transponder, you actually would have to take the knob and turn it for the first digit. You hit enter, then for the second digit, enter. I'm just picking some random numbers, I don't care, and so on. So it's a little harder, as it were, to do that. Not a big deal. Here's the ident button. Here's the VFR button. Again, everything's going to be different, so let them kind of describe what they see. Ident is still pretty simple on most of these and so on. I'm not going to go through all this, but as they give us the cockpit tour, this airplane, they might, among other things, point out, by the way, there's the cabin heat control. This particular airplane, there's a red thing here. Now, it does nothing if you click on it. This particular airplane does have one of these BRS parachutes, a ballistic recovery system parachute for the whole airplane. For phase 1, I would not pull that in virtually any case. I would still wait for the so-called phase 2 situation, get an advanced pilot rated controller in here to help deal with pulling the chute, because if you're going to pull the chute in some of these situations, first of all, it's usually going to be good for most of these situations, not always, and even if you do, there are some things you want to do. So I'm going to wrap up by kind of pretending and simulating that we're going to pull the chute, because it's not modeled in this airplane, and the way I'm going to do it is this. First of all, I'm going to hop outside the airplane for a second and just kind of see where we are. It does look like there's a road here. I'm going to hit V for the VFR map, and I'm going to see if we happen to be near anything. Tonopah? I think that's Tonopah, Nevada, so I'm going to start a right turn, just head off in that direction, but I am not going to take the time to head down towards Tonopah. And for our purposes, for the sake of discussion, for a lot of these parachute type situations, what I would recommend, and this is the short version on this, is if we're talking to somebody like this, and I'm kind of giving you a tease on what the advanced training like this would be, you want to get the plane slowed down, so I'm going to pop back in the plane. I'm going to bring the throttle back, which has more to do with climb and descent rate. I'm going to add some nose-up pitch trim, which you don't really see here, but we are slowing down. If you want to look for it, you can maybe make it out right there on the display. But I'm using pitch trim more for the speed, get it somewhat slowed down, get the throttle pulled back more for the descent rate, get them down to ballpark 1,500-ish feet, maybe 2,000 feet AGL. We definitely want to take the surface winds into account. Like to get them over an open area to the extent we can. We do want to kind of predict what the winds will do in terms of the wind drift during the minute or so that the airplane is under the canopy. In most cases, let's call 911, and one of the reasons we would track them on flightaware.com is so we would have a very good idea of the exact place where they are. In the real world, we would probably fly closer to Tonopah. We wouldn't pull the chute over the city for what I hope for obvious reasons. But for the moment, I'm just going to kind of assume that maybe we're experiencing a very gentle breeze out of the west, just a couple knots. And so if we were to pull the chute somewhere in here, we kind of expect that they will drift down onto or near the road. And even if we were to pull it, say this far out, it'd be nice to wait a few minutes if we could and get some first responders out there. I'm not really expecting that they have to close the road off so much, but get them just kind of in the general vicinity. And for our purposes, I'm going to simulate the chute this way. What I'm going to do is first put the gear down. So let's put the gear down with the switch. Alright, I'm just going to use the button on my yoke. I can't seem to click the right thing there. Gear down will help cushion the vertical impact as the airplane descends at probably about 1,500 feet per minute into the terrain. And then again, we've got the speed slow, we're all set up, we know where they are, so there's no reason for them to hit the ELT. We're going to talk to them in advance about what they're going to do, but basically it's going to be shut the engine off, okay, get the fuel and electrics turned off after they pull the chute. Let's go ahead and do it. So I'm going to bring the throttle to idle. In this airplane, I'm going to turn the mags to off. We're going to pretend to pull the chute, and to simulate that, I'm going to sort of pop outside. I'm just going to leave the switches where they are, and to simulate it, I'm going to hit Y to put us in slew mode, and then we're going to descend at about 1,500-ish feet per minute. I'm actually going to set it up so that it's this button here on my game controller. I'm simulating just a little bit of wind drift, just a knot or two of wind drift. Can't be smooth and precise, so ignore the engine sounds. I do have the engine shut off. In slew mode, it just kind of leaves the engine sound there. And somebody's going to send at ballpark 1,500 feet a minute. Go thunk on the ground as soon as I come out of slew mode. With the Y key, that engine will shut off. And if I hop back inside, we'll do what we couldn't do while I was in slew mode, and just get the electrics turned off while they're descending and so on. Get the fuel shut off while they're descending onto the chute. I couldn't do that while I was in slew mode, and that is how you would do that somewhere in what I think is Nevada in the case of an airplane with a BRS like one of the Cirrus airplanes. So thank you, and I look forward to joining you on some of the more advanced discussion. All controllers are certainly welcome to watch it and engage, but in some sense the advanced discussion will be particularly for advanced pilot-rated controllers in the videos about phases 2 and 3. Thank you.